He traced his daughter's initials in the dust of the moon. Tracy Dawn Cernan. 3 letters carved into the gray, ancient surface of another world, a place where no wind would ever blow them away, where no rain would ever wash them out. A place where those initials will remain perfectly preserved for millions of years after every human being alive today is long gone. And then Gene Cernan climbed the ladder, slowly, reluctantly. Looking back over his shoulder one last time at a landscape no human being had ever stood in before, and no human being has stood in since. That was December 14th, 1972, more than 50 years ago. And here is the question that has never truly been answered, the one that gets more uncomfortable with every passing year. Why did we stop? We had the technology, we had the rockets, we had the astronauts, trained, experienced, brilliant men who had walked on another world and come home to tell the story. We had 6 successful landings, we were getting better at it, more confident, more capable. The equipment was evolving, the science was deepening. By every measure of logic and momentum, we should have kept going. We should have built a base. We should have gone back dozens of times by now. And instead, silence. 53 years of silence. What the astronauts said publicly, what the government admitted officially, and what the real story actually was, those are 3 very different things. And today, with the last of the Apollo generation now in their 80s and 90s, some of them have finally started speaking with a clarity and a rawness that only comes from a man who knows his time is running short. What they have said is not a conspiracy theory. It is not speculation. It is history that powerful people spent decades hoping you would forget. This is the truth about why we stopped going to the moon. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was actually happening in December of 1972 when Gene Cernan stepped off the lunar surface for the last time. It was not the end of a finished program. It was the amputation of a program that was supposed to continue. NASA had originally planned not 6 moon landings, but 10. Apollo 18, Apollo 19, and Apollo 20 were already on the schedule. Rockets were being built, mission profiles were being written. Astronaut crews were already in training. This was not a program winding down by design. This was a program that was cut, suddenly, quietly, and for reasons that were never fully explained to the American public. The first cancellation came in January 1970. Apollo 20 was struck from the schedule. 6 months later, in September 1970, Apollo 18 and Apollo 19 followed. Just like that, 3 missions, 3 opportunities to expand human knowledge of our nearest neighbor in the solar system, were gone. And here is what makes that cancellation even more striking. It happened less than 18 months after Neil Armstrong first stepped on the moon. The world had barely finished celebrating humanity's greatest achievement. The ticker tape from the parades had barely been swept from the streets. And behind closed doors, the decision had already been made to end it. The official reason given was budget, and that is partially true, but only partially. And the parts of the truth that were left out tell a far more interesting and far more troubling story. By the late 1960s, the Apollo program was consuming approximately $4 billion a year, which in today's money represents an almost incomprehensible national investment. At its peak, NASA's budget represented more than 4% of the entire federal budget. For context, it now sits at less than half of 1%. The space race had been won. America had beaten the Soviet Union to the moon, and the cold political reality was simple. The race was over, and nobody wanted to keep paying for a race that had already been won. What is less well known, and what many of the Apollo astronauts have spoken about with increasing frankness in their later years, is the role that President Richard Nixon played in dismantling the program. Nixon was not a man who celebrated the moon landings with any genuine enthusiasm. He was a man who wanted to take credit for them. And he did, placing telephone calls to Armstrong and Aldrin on the lunar surface in a moment of extraordinary self-promotion. But he did not want to fund what came next. One of Nixon's top aides delivered this message directly to NASA, and the transcript of that conversation has been preserved in historical records. The message was stark. The president did not see the need to go further. He did not have the money, and he was not interested in being persuaded otherwise. Nixon had also been deeply shaken by Apollo 13, that near-catastrophic mission in April 1970, when an oxygen tank ruptured on the way to the moon, and 3 astronauts came within a hair's breadth of dying in deep space, had rattled him. He was reportedly terrified that a disaster on his watch, a dead crew broadcast live on every television set in America, would damage him politically. He pushed his advisors to cancel Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 before the 1972 election. Both ultimately flew, narrowly surviving his interference. But the broader program was already dying. And what nobody told the American public at the time was that the 1967 Harris poll had revealed a startling truth about public opinion. 46% of Americans actively opposed the lunar landing program. Only 43% were in favor, and 54% said the price tag was not worth it. The moon landing, that the whole world now remembers as a moment of universal pride and unity, was, at the time, deeply divisive. People were dying in Vietnam. Cities were burning. And a significant portion of the country saw billions of dollars being spent on space travel as a profound moral failure of priorities. The astronauts knew this, and some of them, decades later, have been deeply honest about how that felt. Gene Cernan, before his death in 2017 at the age of 82, said something that deserves to be remembered as one of the most piercing statements ever made by any figure in the history of American space exploration. He said, "After Apollo 17, America stopped looking towards the next horizon. The United States had become a spacefaring nation, but threw it away." He said this with the quiet bitterness of a man who had stood on another world and watched his country decide, almost casually, that it was not worth going back. He testified before Congress, repeatedly pleading for a return to the moon. He never saw it happen. In the final statement released by his family after his death, they wrote that even at 82, Gene was passionate about seeing continued human exploration of space, and that he encouraged the nation's leaders and young people not to let him remain the last man to walk on the moon. He is still the last man to walk on the moon. When he left the lunar surface in December 1972, his final words before climbing that ladder for the last time were carefully chosen. "As I take man's last step from the surface, back home for some time to come, but we believe not too long into the future, I'd like to just say what I believe history will record, that America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And as we leave the moon at Taurus Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. We have not returned." That promise, made in the dust of the moon, broadcast to hundreds of millions of people on Earth, was never kept. And the men who made it spent the rest of their lives carrying the weight of that broken promise, not because they failed, but because the country they served chose not to go back. Charles Duke was the youngest man ever to walk on the moon. He was 36 years old when he stepped onto the lunar surface as part of the Apollo 16 mission in April 1972. A U.S. Air Force brigadier general, a test pilot, a man of absolute discipline and integrity. And, in his later years, as he moved into his 80s, he has spoken with remarkable openness about what the experience of standing on the moon actually did to him, not just physically, but in the deepest parts of who he was as a human being. Duke has described the sensation of standing on the lunar surface as something that fundamentally rearranged his sense of reality. The scale of what he was seeing, the Earth rising over the lunar horizon, the absolute blackness of space, the complete silence, was something that the human brain is simply not built to process comfortably. He described the beauty of the moon as overwhelming, and the desolation as almost spiritual. Wonder and awe, he said, overcome by the beauty of the moon, the desolation. Buzz Aldrin, 3 years before Duke, had called it magnificent desolation. These men were not speaking in empty poetry. They were trying, with the limited instrument of language, to describe an experience that exists outside the range of anything the rest of us will ever know. But Duke also spoke about the near miss that almost cost him his life during the final moonwalk of Apollo 16. In a moment of celebration, he and Commander John Young were conducting what they jokingly called the Moon Olympics, attempting high jumps in the lunar gravity. Duke leaped into the air and the weight of his backpack shifted his center of gravity backward. He began falling, helplessly in slow motion toward the lunar surface. His backpack was not designed for high-impact landings. It contained his oxygen supply, his regulators, his entire life support system. If it had shattered on impact, he would have been dead within minutes, millions of miles from the nearest hospital. He managed to scramble and land on his right side. He survived. But it was the kind of incident that reminds you just how thin the margin was between triumph and catastrophe on every single one of these missions. The question of radiation is one that has been discussed with increasing honesty by the surviving Apollo astronauts, and it is one of the authentic, scientifically documented reasons why returning to the moon is significantly harder than people realize. When the Apollo astronauts flew to the moon, they passed through the Van Allen belts, two massive zones of intense radiation trapped by Earth's magnetic field that surround our planet like invisible shields. They crossed these belts as quickly as possible, following trajectories specifically designed to minimize their time in the most dangerous regions. The Apollo crews spent approximately 52 minutes passing through the inner belt. They received a radiation dose roughly comparable to a medical CT scan, manageable with careful mission planning. But here is what people rarely discuss. The Apollo astronauts got extraordinarily lucky with solar weather. In August 1972, between the Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 missions, one of the largest solar particle events ever recorded erupted from the surface of the sun. A massive release of high-energy radiation flooded the inner solar system. As researchers who have studied this event have stated plainly, if that solar event had occurred during an Apollo mission, it would have been extremely hazardous for the astronauts. potentially fatal. The margin between the Apollo program's success and a catastrophic televised loss of a crew was, on at least one occasion, a matter of timing rather than planning. This is not speculation. This is documented. And it is one of the genuine, scientifically honest reasons why longer stays on the moon, the kind needed to establish a real base or conduct serious long-term exploration, present radiation challenges that 1970s technology was simply not equipped to handle. Galactic cosmic rays, high-energy atomic fragments arriving from outside our solar system at nearly the speed of light, present a continuous, essentially unshieldable hazard for anyone spending extended time in deep space. The Earth's magnetic field protects us from this radiation. On the moon, there is no such protection. Every hour a human being spends on the lunar surface, they accumulate a dose of radiation that has no analog in normal human experience. This was not the primary reason Apollo ended, but it is part of why returning with the ambition and the duration that genuine exploration would require is harder, more dangerous, and more expensive than simply going back for a few days the way Apollo did. The economic reality of what was lost when Apollo ended has never been fully reckoned with. NASA originally planned 10 moon landings. 6 happened. The hardware for the remaining missions was not destroyed. Some of it still exists. Saturn V rockets that were never flown are on display in museums in Houston and Cape Canaveral. You can walk up to them and touch them. Rockets that were built, that were ready, that could have carried human beings to the moon, sitting as museum pieces, because the decision was made to stop. The Saturn V itself is perhaps the most remarkable piece of engineering in human history. It stood 363 feet tall. At launch, it generated 7.6 million pounds of thrust, a figure so large it barely registers as real. It went from blueprints to launch pad in 6 years. It flew its first crewed mission in 1968 and put human beings on the moon 7 months later. No rocket built since has matched its payload capacity. No rocket today can carry as much mass to the moon as the Saturn V could. We built the greatest rocket in history and then we stopped building it. We canceled the production line. We lost the institutional knowledge. Engineers retired. Documentation was lost, scattered, imperfectly preserved. When NASA decided in the 2000s to go back to the moon with the Constellation program, they essentially had to start from scratch. And it cost them far more time and money than the original program had for a result that never flew. The Constellation program was canceled by the Obama administration in 2010. The space launch system that eventually replaced it, the rocket now planned to carry the Artemis astronauts back to the moon, has cost $93 billion and is still not ready to carry a human crew to the lunar surface. The Saturn V moved from paper to moon in 6 years. Its successor has been in development for decades and has not yet achieved what it was built to do. That is not a criticism of the engineers and scientists working on it. They are brilliant people working within a system that was broken by the political decisions of the 1970s and has never fully healed. What the astronauts have collectively told us, through their public statements, their testimonies to Congress, their memoirs and interviews and documentaries, is something that the official history of the Apollo program tends to soften. They are telling us that what happened after Apollo 17 was not a measured, rational decision to pause before the next great step. It was an abandonment. It was America choosing, in the language of Gene Cernan himself, to throw away the status of a spacefaring nation. It was a decision driven by political calculation, budgetary pressure, and a failure of imagination and courage at the highest levels of government. Cernan said it plainly. America stopped looking toward the next horizon. Charles Duke has spoken about the spiritual transformation the moon wrought in him, an experience so profound that he has dedicated much of his life since to sharing what it felt like to be one of the 12 human beings ever to stand on another world. And what both of them have made clear, in different ways, is that the moon is not just a destination. It is a mirror. It shows you exactly who you are and what you're capable of. And when America turned away from it in 1972, something important was lost. Not just in science, not just in exploration, but in the national character itself. Buzz Aldrin, the second human being ever to walk on the moon, stood at a gala marking the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing and said something that cut to the heart of all of this. He said, "I sometimes think the three of us missed the big event. While we were out there on the moon, the world was growing closer together, right here." He meant it as a beautiful reflection on the unifying power of what Apollo had achieved. But there is another way to read those words. While 12 men were walking on another world, changing forever what was possible for our species, the world was growing closer together here. And then it moved on. And the men who had gone to the moon came home to a country that was already looking at something else. That is the truth that the Apollo astronauts have spent decades carrying. Not a secret, not a cover-up, not a conspiracy. Something harder than any of those things. A missed opportunity on a civilizational scale, driven by the most ordinary and mundane of human failures. Politics, budget, fear, short attention spans. the decision of powerful men to invest in what was cheap rather than what was great. Today, the Artemis program promises to return human beings to the moon. The timeline has slipped repeatedly. What was once promised for 2024 is now targeted tentatively for the late 2020s. The congressional watchdog has estimated only a 70% chance of the Starship lunar lander being ready by 2028. History has a pattern: a bold announcement, initial funding, a change in administration, and then redirection. Going to the moon requires sustained investment across multiple presidential terms. And American politics has never naturally supported that. But here is what is different now. For the first time in 50 years, there are other nations looking at the moon with serious ambitions. China has stated explicitly its intention to put humans on the lunar surface before the end of this decade. The European Space Agency, India, Japan, they are all building lunar programs with a seriousness that the post-Apollo decades never saw. The moon is no longer the exclusive ambition of one nation in a Cold War race. It is a destination that the world is converging on. And that convergence may finally produce the sustained political will that the Apollo generation spent their lifetimes begging for. Gene Cernan testified before Congress. He pleaded, he argued, he pointed to those footprints still sitting in the lunar dust. His footprints, visible to any telescope powerful enough to resolve them, exactly where he left them in 1972, perfectly preserved in a place where nothing changes. And he said, go back, honor what was started, finish what was begun. He died in 2017, still the last man on the moon. His initials, TDC, his daughter Tracy's, are still there in the dust, waiting. The truth that the Apollo astronauts have been telling us in different words and different moments across more than 5 decades is this. The decision to stop was not inevitable. It was not the natural end of a program that had reached its limit. It was a choice, a deliberate, politically motivated, historically short-sighted choice made by people who could not see past the next election cycle to the century that lay beyond it. And the cost of that choice has been 50 years of lost time, lost knowledge, and lost potential. We stopped going to the moon not because we couldn't, not because it was too dangerous, not because there was nothing left to discover. We stopped because the people in power decided that the dream was too expensive to maintain, and because not enough of the rest of us pushed back hard enough to stop them. That is the truth. It is not dramatic, it is not mysterious, it is, in a way, more heartbreaking than any conspiracy could ever be, because it means that the greatest adventure in human history was not ended by some outside force. It was ended by us, by our own choices, by our own failures of vision and courage and will. Gene Cernan wanted to return. Every Apollo astronaut who has spoken publicly has said the same thing. Go back. The moon is still there. The footprints are still there. The initials carved in the dust are still there. We just have to decide, finally and for real this time, that we are going back.